At my mother's funeral, my mother-in-law stood there with a smug grin, completely unfazed by the grief in the air. As if the sorrow of losing my mother wasn't enough, she boldly declared, "This house will be inherited by my son." She then wandered through the rooms, casually inspecting them as if she were shopping for furniture. "I wonder if I should take this one," she mused, running her hand along the walls. I forced a polite smile and firmly corrected her. "Actually, I'm the one inheriting this house." Without missing a beat, she chuckled.
Oh, I know.
"But isn't it true that a wife's belongings belong to her husband? So, in a way, this house belongs to my son, right?" I sighed, baffled by her audacity. Before I could even respond, she cheerfully added, "Anyway, from now on, let's try to get along." I hesitated. "What do you mean by get along?" She beamed, completely ignoring the grief on my face. "Well, I'll be moving in, of course. This will be my room." Shocked, I asked, "You mean we'll be living together?" "Exactly," she said with confidence. "A house this big shouldn't go to waste. It makes perfect sense for 3 people to live here instead of leaving so many rooms empty, don't you think?" I clenched my fists, my heart aching from the loss of my mother. Did she really think this was the right time to bring up something so ridiculous? Couldn't she see my pain? This house wasn't just a building. It held years of precious memories, built by my hardworking father and cherished by my loving mother. The thought of my overbearing mother-in-law taking over made my stomach turn. Worse, my husband just stood there, saying nothing to stop her. I knew I had to take control before she forced her way in. But let me take a step back. I'm a 43-year-old office worker. Marriage wasn't something I ever thought would happen for me. I had given up on the idea after turning 40. But then, through an acquaintance, I met Paul. He was 5 years younger than me, kind, and always put my opinions first. When we were planning our honeymoon, he asked, "Where should we go? You mentioned wanting to visit Europe, right?" I smiled. "Yes, but didn't you say you preferred the Singapore?" "Then let's go to the Singapore," he said without hesitation. At that time, I truly believed he was someone who valued my feelings. But now, as I watched him stay silent while his mother took control, doubt crept into my heart. A few months after our wedding, he dropped a bombshell. "My mom wants to live with us," he said one evening. "My dad's health isn't great, and she's struggling to handle things on her own." I frowned. "I understand that she's going through a tough time, but didn't we agree before marriage that we wouldn't live together with her?" He looked away, avoiding my gaze. And in that moment, I realized this battle wasn't just with my mother-in-law. It was with my husband, too. I hesitated for a moment before asking, "Are you really going to talk to your mom about this?" My husband nodded. "You're right. I'll bring it up with her." Paul was the type of man who always listened to me, no matter how small my concerns were. I appreciated it, but sometimes I felt guilty, like I was being too selfish. It was a blessing to have a husband as kind as him, yet there was one regret that always lingered in my heart. My father had passed away 4 years before I got married. He never got to see me in my wedding dress, never had the chance to walk me down the aisle, and never got the reassurance that I had found someone who would love and care for me. My father had been a strict but hardworking man. He was an executive at a small to medium-sized company. Even though his business wasn't large, he earned a decent income, and our family home was big enough to hold gatherings and even funerals. I deeply respected him. When I started working as an office employee, I began to understand the real struggles of maintaining a job, dealing with responsibilities, and carrying the weight of expectations. My admiration for my father only grew with time. The sacrifices he had made for our family became clearer to me, and I wished I could have told him just how much I appreciated everything he did. Then, 3 years after my marriage, another tragedy struck. My mother passed away. "Even your mom?" my husband murmured, his voice filled with concern. "Are you okay? You should take a break in the back room." Funerals at home weren't very common anymore, but I had chosen to hold my mother's ceremony in our family house, just like we did for my father. It felt right. It was a place filled with memories, and I wanted to send her off surrounded by the love she had built here. Throughout the funeral, my husband stayed by my side. He made sure I was drinking water, gently urged me to sit down whenever I looked exhausted, and handled guests when I needed a moment alone. In my grief, I still found myself thinking, I am lucky to have such a caring husband. But then my mother-in-law, Jessica, arrived. With a solemn expression, she approached me and said, "My deepest condolences. I sincerely sympathize with you." I nodded and forced a small, polite smile. "Thank you, Jessica," and I never had a particularly close relationship. We didn't live together, and our interactions were usually brief and formal. I had always appreciated the reasonable distance we kept, but something about her presence that day felt different, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. After the ceremony ended, Jessica approached me again. This time, she had an unusual expression, one that didn't match the mood of the day. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at me. She smiled, almost too warmly, and said, "We really appreciate your help with the funeral. Thanks to you, everything went smoothly." I was about to thank her, assuming she was simply being polite. But before I could respond, she suddenly added in a casual, almost playful tone, "Well, now that the funeral is over, don't you think it's time to drop the formalities?" I stiffened.
What did she mean by that?
For a moment, I thought she was just trying to lighten the mood, maybe encourage me to move forward. But as she continued speaking, I realized that wasn't her intention at all. She glanced around the house, her eyes filled with something I could only describe as admiration, but not the sentimental kind. It was more like someone inspecting a valuable piece of property. "This is such a splendid house," she commented, almost as if she were talking to herself. I frowned. Something about her tone put me on edge. "Wait a moment," I started, but before I could say anything else, she began walking deeper into the house, completely ignoring me. My heart pounded in my chest. What was she doing? And then, all at once, it hit me. This wasn't just a visit to pay respects. Jessica had come here for something else entirely. I frowned. "Mom, this is really inconvenient. Some areas are still messy." My mother-in-law, Jessica, waved off my concerns as if they were nothing. "Oh, don't fuss over small details. What's more important is that this house will be inherited by my son." She strolled through the house with an air of entitlement, casually scanning the rooms as if she were picking out a new wardrobe. Then, stopping at one of the larger rooms, she mused, "I wonder if I should take this one." I felt my stomach twist. "Mom," I began, hesitating for a moment before gathering my courage. "Actually, I'm the one inheriting this house." Jessica smirked, clearly unfazed by my words. "Oh, I know. But your parents didn't have any other children, right? And doesn't everything a wife owns ultimately belong to her husband? So, in essence, this house belongs to my son." I let out a deep sigh, trying to control my growing frustration. Was she really twisting logic to claim my family home as hers? She clapped her hands together cheerfully. "Anyway, from now on, let's try to get along." I narrowed my eyes. Something about the way she said that didn't sit right with me. Before I could question her, she confidently continued, "I mean, I'll be turning this room into my own." My breath caught in my throat. "Wait, does that mean you're planning to live here?" Without a hint of hesitation, she replied, "Exactly. I've decided. A house this splendid shouldn't go to waste with empty rooms. It makes perfect sense for 3 people to live here rather than leaving all this space unused, don't you think?" Then, as if to justify herself further, she sighed dramatically. Finally. I won't have to take care of my son all by myself anymore." I clenched my fists. My mother had passed away recently, and yet here she was, talking about taking over my home as if it were just some casual arrangements. Anger bubbled inside me. Could she not see the pain I was going through? Why was she saying such ridiculous things at a time like this? Just as my patience was wearing thin, my husband, Paul, who had been standing nearby, finally noticed the tension. He quickly stepped in.
"Mom."
"What are you saying?" His voice was firm, his brows furrowed in frustration. "This isn't the right time for this kind of discussion." Jessica, undeterred, rolled her eyes. "Oh, why make such a fuss?" Paul didn't back down. "Just leave, Mom. he said firmly. Then, without waiting for her to protest, he guided her out of the house. Before leaving, Jessica threw me one last glance, but for once, she said nothing. Paul turned back to me, rubbing his temples. I'm really sorry. My mom can be unreasonable sometimes. I exhaled, relieved. It's fine. Thanks for handling it. I truly felt grateful to have a husband who stood up for me. But in the days that followed, I would come to realize that Paul's idea of handling things was different from mine. 12 days after my mother's funeral, as the heavy sorrow began to settle, we finally sat down to discuss what would happen to my family home. I assumed we were on the same page, that we would continue living in our small apartment and decide what to do with the house later. But Paul suddenly made an unexpected proposal. This apartment feels cramped, he said casually. Shouldn't we move back into your parents' house? I blinked. Move back. He nodded. Yeah, with all of our belongings and, the possibility of having kids in the future. It's better than squeezing into this tiny apartment. I hesitated. A part of me understood his reasoning. The house was big, and our current apartment was indeed small, but something about the way he brought it up made me uneasy. Then, after a pause, Paul added in a quieter voice, well, we should start preparing for the move. I swallowed hard. There was a pressing concern I needed to address. Paul, there's something important I need to ask about this move. He hesitated, as if already knowing what I was about to say. His expression turned uneasy. After a long pause, he finally spoke. Considering how spacious the house is and all the empty rooms, I could already tell where this was going. And I didn't like it one bit. I stared at my husband in disbelief. Are you saying you want your parents to move in with us? Paul hesitated, but then nodded. I just thought since the house is big, it could work. A cold wave of frustration washed over me. Lately, I had started noticing subtle changes in my husband. I used to believe he valued my opinions, but now, I wasn't so sure. Was he truly supportive, or was he just a people pleaser? Maybe even a pushover? His willingness to entertain my mother-in-law's every request, despite my clear objections, made me question where his loyalty truly lay. I had made it clear, over and over again, that I was against living together with his mother. And yet, he kept bringing it up. Haven't I told you repeatedly? We are not living together with her. I reminded him, my voice firm. Paul sighed. I know, but Mom keeps insisting. I scoffed. During the funeral, you scolded her for barging into my family home, didn't you? You stood up for me. You were against cohabitation back then. What changed? He ran a hand through his hair, looking uncomfortable. Yes, I was upset that she just walked in like that, but that doesn't mean I'm completely against the idea of living together. I just thought it was wrong for her to make such a big decision so casually, especially on that day. I crossed my arms. So what? Now that some time has passed, you think it's okay? Paul nodded slowly. I just think it deserves a proper discussion. I sighed heavily. I could see it now, he was not fully on my side. He was trying to stay neutral, acting as if he was weighing both sides fairly. But people like him, who try too hard to remain impartial, often end up hurting the ones they should be standing up for. It was infuriating. I refused to live with someone who had barged into my family home on the day of my mother's funeral and declared which room she would take. My stance would not change. Tell your mom we're not living together. Make it clear, I demanded. Paul frowned. You really seem bothered by this. Of course, I am. I snapped. Just tell her. Fine, I will, he sighed, clearly reluctant. Before we got married, I had mentally prepared myself for the possibility of living with my in-laws one day. But after seeing my mother-in-law's behavior at my mother's funeral, that possibility had become completely unthinkable. This home was built by my father and cherished by my mother. Letting my pushy mother-in-law take over was out of the question. However, when Paul finally conveyed my opposition, my mother-in-law didn't take it well. Instead of respecting my decision, she called me directly. Why are you so against cohabitation when there's such a big house? She asked, her voice sharp. You're Paul's wife now. That makes his father and me your parents too, doesn't it? Why do you have such a strong opposition to living with us? I clenched my jaw. I've already explained to Paul why I'm against it. Your reasons make no sense, she snapped. Are you abandoning us? I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. I'm not abandoning anyone. But I know how this would turn out. My father-in-law has health issues, and if we live together, I'll be the one expected to take care of everything. That's not fair. Silence stretched between us before she spoke again, her tone dripping with disapproval. You really are heartless. Her words stung, but I refused to let them shake me. If cohabitation was ever to be considered, a significant change in both my husband's and mother-in-law's attitudes would be the absolute minimum requirement. But just a few days after that conversation, I was in for another surprise. I walked into the living room to find my husband moving furniture around. The couch was pushed against the wall, the coffee table had been shifted, and he seemed to be creating extra space. I frowned. Paul, what are you doing? He looked up at me, hesitant but determined. And I had a sinking feeling that I wasn't going to like his answer. I asked, what are you doing? Is this for storing moving boxes? He shook his head. No, I'm making space for 3 beds here. Hearing 3 beds made my heart sink. I hesitated before asking, are your parents coming to stay? To my shock, he said, no, they're moving in today. Even before they arrived, I realized what was happening. No matter how much I objected, my husband and his mother were forcing me to live with them. Why is this happening? I asked, feeling frustrated. He explained their lease ended, so we decided they'd move here instead of renewing it. It'll be a tight fit for 4 people, but we're moving soon, right? Just put up with it for a little while. Feeling upset, I said, that's not what I meant. Why are we even talking about living together? I told you before, I don't want to live with someone who walked into my parents' house on the day of the funeral and suggested moving in. I'll talk to Mom, he said. We're going to be living together from now on, so please try to get along. I felt angry. Why do you always put your mom first? It's not about taking sides, he insisted. I listened to both of you and made the best decision. But I knew that wasn't true. When it came to his mother, he was completely under her influence. He believed he was making his own choices, but in reality, she was guiding him. I used to think of him as kind, but when he was with her, he became difficult, forcing me into a life I never wanted. When my in-laws moved into our tiny apartment, my mother-in-law immediately started complaining about the space. Feeling forced to apologize, I said, we'll manage until we move. My father-in-law, Ryan, seemed polite and didn't cause trouble, but I could tell he was following my mother-in-law's lead. He was just another yes man. A few days later, my mother-in-law asked me to run an errand to buy her a medicated patch. It was a small thing, but I felt irritated. Why was she making decisions without even asking me? I worried this was just the beginning of bigger demands. I knew I couldn't live like this. My in-laws were already preparing to move into my parents' house, so I decided to act first. While my mother-in-law excitedly talked about how much space she would have, I made my own secret plans. I wasn't going to let her take over my parents' home. After about 12 days, I finally told them my decision. I handed over the official court document and said, that house means so much to me. I can't stand the thought of you living there, so I gave up my inheritance. Now, it will just be a beautiful memory in my heart. My mother-in-law exploded. Are you crazy? Even if you didn't want it, you could have sold it and made money. Why would you just give it up? I calmly said, even if I sold the house, you would just depend on that money next. I thought it would be easier if I had nothing at all. She snapped back. We left our old home for this move. What are you doing? How are you going to make this up to us? I stood my ground. I've always said I don't want to live together, but you forced it on me without asking. So I made my own decision. Both my husband and mother-in-law looked shocked when they heard that I had given up my inheritance. Their faces turned pale, and they had no words. My father-in-law looked confused as he watched them. But I wasn't finished. Paul, I said, turning to my husband, I've been thinking about getting a divorce. What do you think? He stuttered. Divorce? My mother-in-law jumped in immediately. Paul, you should divorce this foolish woman right now. I expected her to say that. But I wanted to see if my husband could make his own decision in such an important moment.
Mom.
He mumbled, unsure of what to say. But by then, my mind was made up.
Fine.
Divorce is the only choice, my mother-in-law said angrily. My father-in-law spoke next. Paul, your mother insists on it, so you have no choice. Then my husband finally said, well, you seem to want a divorce too, so maybe it's for the best. Even now, my husband and father-in-law just followed whatever my mother-in-law wanted. And my husband acted like he was agreeing with me, as if it was my idea. All right then, I said. Let's go through with a divorce. I packed only a few things and left. That night, I stayed in a cheap hotel. The next morning, I took half a day off work and went straight to the courthouse. A few days later, my mother-in-law called me, shouting,
You.
What is going on? I just found out the house is becoming yours. Why? I replied calmly, Oh, so you found out through the estate paperwork? Yes. That house belongs to you? You lied and tricked us. I sighed. Why would I fake legal documents? Those papers are real. Then why is the house still yours? You said you were giving it up. I explained. Right after I showed you those papers, I took back my application. Giving up an inheritance isn't final right away. It takes about a month to be approved. Until then, you can change your mind anytime. The documents I showed you were just part of the process, not the final approval. I had tricked them into thinking I had given up the house. I wanted to see their real reactions and decide what to do next. I never expected my mother-in-law to change, but I hoped, at the very least, that my husband would stop and tell me he didn't want a divorce. I had planned to take my time and explain everything about the house later. But my mother-in-law wasn't giving up. So, the house is really yours now. Since you got it before the divorce, doesn't that mean it should be divided as property? In that case, shouldn't you and Paul split the money from selling it? She was determined to take whatever she could, knowing she couldn't have the house itself. But I had already thought about this. If we had bought the house together, then yes, it would be divided. But this house was inherited, not purchased, so it's not included in the property division. She didn't stop. What about the money Paul should get from the divorce? I stayed calm. We were only married a few years. There's not much to split. Maybe just the car, but it still has a loan on it. She called me selfish and heartless. I replied, I'm protecting this house because it holds precious memories of my parents. I don't want people like you living in it. If you have any more complaints, talk to a lawyer. After that, the divorce moved quickly. My mother-in-law probably pressured Paul to speed it up. Either way, it was finalized, and I was finally free from them. I felt relieved, as if I had saved my father's home from being taken over. After I moved out, my ex-in-laws stayed in the same small apartment where I used to live with my ex-husband. Even with one less person, it was still cramped. My former mother-in-law started looking for a new place, but since they were older, they had trouble getting approved for rentals. In the end, my ex-husband rented a small house for them. It's smaller than the apartment, but because it's a house, the rent is probably higher. He also has to take care of them financially. Life won't be easy for him. At first, his mother was excited about moving into the big house my father left behind. But now, she has to settle for something much smaller. I'm sure she's disappointed. As for me, I've started a new chapter in the home my parents left me. The house feels warm, as if they're still here with me. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel.
See you next time.